My daughter said, "Obey my husband or get out," so I took my pillow and the retirement money she counted on. The dining room lights glowed warm and golden that night, but the warmth in that house had long since drained away. I sat at the table where I had once imagined grandchildren laughing with love, a daughter who respected the woman who had raised her, and perhaps even a son-in-law who saw me as family. Instead, what I faced was a stage set for humiliation. The walls of that house, a house I had helped pay for with my retirement savings, echoed with cruelty. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, the clinking of silverware punctuated the silence, and then Derek leaned back in his chair, spreading himself out like a king surveying his kingdom. He crossed his legs, lifted his foot, and smirked at me. "Old witch," he said in that mocking drawl of his. "Bring me a basin of water and wash my feet. In this house, women serve the men. That's how it works." The laughter from his friends at the table cut through me like glass. I swallowed, my hands trembling in my lap, but I lifted my chin. "I am your wife's mother," I said slowly, carefully enunciating every word so it carried the weight of dignity I still clung to. "Not your servant." For a moment the room froze. Even the children stopped chewing, their eyes darting between their father and me. Then Derek's grin twisted into something uglier. He shot up from his chair, strode toward me, and before I could rise, his foot lashed out hard against my side. Pain seared through my ribs as my chair jolted backward, legs scraping the tile. I caught the edge of the table to steady myself, but my breath caught in my throat, sharp and shallow. The sound of the kick had barely died when Lydia, my only child, my daughter whom I had carried, raised, and sacrificed for, slammed her spoon down on the table with a clang. Her voice rang louder than the strike. "Mother," she barked, "do as my husband says or get out of this house. You think you have rights here? You do not. This is our home now, not yours. If you cannot respect my husband, then tomorrow morning you can take your pillow and sleep outside. You are not going to embarrass us any more." I turned toward her, hoping, just hoping, for a flicker of compassion in her face, some sign that she still saw me as her mother, but there was nothing, only cold contempt in her eyes, as though I were not blood, but some unwanted tenant overstaying her welcome. The children laughed, as children mimic cruelty when it is taught at home. "Grandma stinks," one of them said, snickering. "She should go sleep in the garage with the rats," another chimed in. "Maybe if she washes Dad's feet, she'll finally be useful." My chest burned as I sat frozen, my hands gripping the arms of the chair until my knuckles went white. Not one person came to my side. Not one asked if I was hurt. Not one spoke up against Derek's violence or Lydia's decree. In a house that would not exist without my labor, my sacrifices, my money, I was treated like an intruder, a nuisance, a burden. The meal continued as though nothing had happened. Derek returned to his seat, stuffing food into his mouth with an air of triumph. Lydia lifted her glass, sipping wine as though she had just defended her honor rather than destroyed it. The children whispered and laughed, shooting me sidelong glances as if I were some character in a cruel joke. I sat silently, my ribs aching, the sting of Derek's kick pulsing through me like a reminder of my humiliation. The clinking of cutlery and the murmur of voices swelled around me, but I felt as if I were trapped in a glass case, separated from the humanity of the others. My dignity, already frayed, had been ripped apart in front of everyone. The home I had once believed would be my safe place in old age had turned into a stage where my degradation was entertainment. I wanted to shout, I wanted to scream that I had built this life, that without me Lydia would never have gone to college, never have had a chance at the career that allowed her to meet Derek in the first place. I wanted to remind them that the money they used to renovate this very kitchen had come from my savings, the savings I had earned with aching feet and blistered hands. I wanted to throw every ungrateful word back at them until they tasted the bitterness of their betrayal, but my throat was tight, my voice locked behind a wall of grief, and so I did the only thing I could. I sat in silence. Silence has its own weight. It filled the room thicker than the smell of the roast, sharper than the glint of the knives. My daughter mistook it for weakness. My son-in-law mistook it for surrender. But as the laughter of my grandchildren pricked at my ears and the ache in my ribs pulsed with every breath, I knew my silence was something else entirely. It was a memory. It was a ledger, taking note of every cruel word, every contemptuous glance, every act of humiliation. It was patience, coiling inside me like a spring, waiting for the right moment. Lydia leaned toward Derek, her voice a hiss I was not supposed to hear but did. She needs to learn her place. Tomorrow I'll make sure she's gone. Derek chuckled, his hand brushing hers across the table. She won't last a week outside. Maybe then she'll crawl back and beg. The words carved themselves into my heart. My own daughter is plotting my exile, the man she had chosen relishing the idea of my humiliation. They thought they had broken me with one kick, with one ultimatum, with one night of cruelty. But in that very moment, as my fingers clutched the fabric of my chair, I realized something else entirely. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. I would not scream. I would not weep. I would not beg. But I would remember. And when the time came, I would rise, not as the servant they imagined, but as the mother they had underestimated. So I lifted my fork, ignoring the pain in my side, and forced myself to eat one bite, then another, not because I was hungry, but because I refused to let them see me falter. I swallowed their disdain with my food, digesting it into fuel. Each cruel word was stored away like a coin in a jar, accruing interest in silence. They laughed. They mocked. They declared that I had no place in the house I helped buy. But in my heart, I whispered the vow that would sustain me. You will regret this night. You will regret every word, every laugh, every act of cruelty. And as I clutched the pillow I would carry with me, I knew that what they mistook for weakness was already sharpening into something far stronger than their arrogance. Their cruelty had written the prologue. I would write the ending. When I look back on the years that brought me to that dinner table, I realize the cruelty of that night was not sudden. It was not born in a single moment when Derek lifted his foot against me or when my daughter told me to obey him or get out. No, that night was simply the harvest of seeds they had been sowing for years, watered by my sacrifices and twisted by their ingratitude. I worked my entire life with hands that never seemed to stop aching. When Lydia was young, I stitched together 3 jobs just to keep us afloat. In the mornings, I scrubbed floors in offices that gleamed with other people's prosperity. In the afternoons, I took in laundry, my fingers raw from the detergents, folding clothes for women who lived lives of ease while mine was spent chasing overdue bills. At night, after Lydia was asleep, I worked the counter at a corner store, fighting exhaustion as I smiled at strangers buying cigarettes and beer. I lived on coffee and determination, and every cent I made went toward Lydia's food, her clothes, her school supply. I told myself that the exhaustion didn't matter, that one day she would understand, that one day she would look at me and say, "Thank you, Mom. I see what you did for me." But that day never came. When Lydia turned 18, I did the unthinkable. I signed over my small savings account, money I had been setting aside for my old age so she could go to college without loans crushing her. It was everything I had, my safety net, the only cushion between me and poverty. When I told her, her eyes did not fill with gratitude. She did not hug me or cry. Instead, she shrugged and said, "Well, if you hadn't, I would have found another way. Don't think this means you've done me a huge favor." Her words landed heavier than any bill I had ever struggled to pay. It was as though my sacrifice had been erased before it was even made. Years later, when Derek entered our lives, the small remnants of my dignity were chipped away further. I kept a photograph on the wall, a black and white picture of my husband and me on our wedding day. He had passed so young, leaving me alone to raise our daughter. That picture was one of the only things that made me feel he was still with me. One afternoon, Derek walked into the room, glanced at it, and laughed. "This old thing?" he sneered. "It makes the place look cheap, like a relic from a poor family that never moved forward. You should take it down before guests see it. It's embarrassing." Lydia agreed. "Mom, you need to stop living in the past. That photo is depressing. It lowers the whole tone of the house." The photo that had once given me comfort was stripped from the wall and shoved into a drawer, hidden like something shameful. The land in Texas where I was born, a small patch of soil where my parents had planted pecan trees, was the only piece of my family's legacy I had left. I told Lydia I wanted to keep it, that I dreamed of being buried there near my roots. Her face hardened. "You're so selfish," she spat. "We could sell that land and have money to expand the restaurant." You're clinging to dirt while we're trying to build a future. Why can't you ever help us when we need it? Selfish. That was the word she used for a woman who had never once spent $1 on herself when her daughter needed it more. Even the meals I cooked became weapons against me. I had grown up making tamales and chili the way my mother taught me, recipes that carried the taste of home. One evening I set a pot on the stove, hoping to share a bit of that warmth with Lydia and the children. As soon as Derek walked in, his nose wrinkled. Lydia fanned the air as though it were smoke. "God, Mom," she said, her voice full of disgust. "This house smells awful. Nobody wants your greasy food here. You're making us look low class. Stop cooking your old dishes. It's embarrassing." The meal was dumped in the trash, and I stood there, holding the wooden spoon, feeling like the ghost of a woman who no longer had a place at her own table. The little indignities added up. When Lydia was a girl, she used to show off the sweaters I knit for her. "Look what my mom made me," she would shout proudly on the playground, tugging at her friends' sleeves so they could feel the stitches. Her pride had once filled me with joy. But in college, when she cleaned out her closet, she picked up one of those same sweaters, curled her lip, and tossed it into the garbage. "These look cheap. Don't let anyone see them." I watched it fall into the trash like a piece of myself being discarded. It became clear that nothing I did, nothing I gave, nothing I sacrificed would ever be enough. To Lydia, my work, my love, my traditions were not gifts, but stains on her life. To Derek, I was not a mother-in-law but an obstacle, a reminder that he had married a woman who came from nothing, who had been raised on hard work instead of wealth. And yet, whenever money was needed, they came to me. Lydia needed help paying for the rehearsal dinner. She sent me the invoices with a curt, "Just handle it, Mom." Derek wanted a co-signer for his flashy car. When I refused, I was accused of holding them back. "You don't want us to succeed," Derek sneered. "You're jealous of us. You want us to fail so you won't look so small." Lydia echoed him. "Mom, why can't you ever just support me?" Support, in her mind, meant emptying my pockets, my soul, my very essence, while receiving nothing but scorn in return. Every choice I made to preserve some piece of myself became another strike against me in their eyes. Keeping my husband's photo was weakness. Holding on to my family's land was selfish. Cooking our food was low class. Refusing to gamble my future on Derek's debts was betrayal. The scale was rigged, the judgment already decided. By the time Derek kicked me in front of the children, and Lydia told me to obey or leave, the truth was undeniable. They had been pushing me out for years. That night was not the first betrayal, it was the culmination of a lifetime of erasure. I had not been seen as a mother for a very long time. I was a wallet, a cook to be mocked, a housekeeper to be scorned, a relic to be discarded when inconvenient. And as the weight of all those years pressed down on me, as I clutched the pillow that would become my companion in exile, the fire inside me grew. They thought I would break. They thought I would crumble under their cruelty. But they forgot that I had carried them through storms greater than this. They forgot that I was the woman who worked 3 jobs and still found the strength to braid her daughter's hair before school. They forgot that the woman they called selfish had given up every piece of herself to see her child succeed. That was their mistake, because the moment they erased me, the moment they stripped me of dignity in that house, I was no longer their servant. I was something else. Something they had underestimated. And in that silence, in the ache of my ribs and the bitterness of their words, I began to plan. That night, after Derek's kick still throbbed in my ribs and Lydia's command still echoed in my ears, I went to my small room at the back of the house. I closed the door quietly, not because I feared them, but because silence had become my shield. I sat on the bed, clutching the pillow Lydia had mocked, and from beneath the mattress I pulled out a worn leather folder. Inside were papers, contracts, and bank slips, pages they had pushed in front of me with impatient hands, signatures they had demanded with voices sharp as knives. They thought I had signed blindly, too old and too foolish to read the fine print. They thought wrong. Derek had been so sure of himself when he opened his restaurant. He had preened like a rooster, talking about how he would be the next big name in Texas dining. He had bragged about investors and profit margins, about expansion plans and franchising. But behind closed doors, he had leaned on me. "Just sign here," he had said, waving the contract like a favor he was granting me. Your name and credit are good. You're not doing anything with your retirement anyway. This way you can actually be useful. Lydia had stood at his side, arms crossed, daring me to refuse. And so, for my daughter's sake, I signed. But I read every word. I studied the clauses late into the night when they thought I was sleeping. And there it was. A single line buried in the dense text, a clause Derek and his lawyer had overlooked because they never imagined it would matter. If the primary benefactor of the establishment is publicly humiliated by the managing partners or their family, the benefactor has the right to withdraw all investment immediately, resulting in the automatic suspension of all business operations and the return of all funds. They had humiliated me, not in whispers, not in the privacy of anger, but openly, in front of children, in front of family, in the very house my money had helped buy. That clause was no longer words on paper, it was a sword I could wield. So that night, as they laughed in the living room, as Derek belched and Lydia pretended she had achieved something by putting her mother in her place, I packed. I took my pillow, yes, the one they ridiculed me for. I took a small bag of clothes, and I took that folder, clutching it to my chest like armor. When I stepped out into the night air, I did not cry. I did not even look back. The house behind me was not home. It was a cage. At dawn, I was sitting in the office of the bank manager. He had known me for years, seen me deposit my wages with shaking hands, seen me count every penny of my savings. His eyes flickered with surprise when I handed him the folder. I want to invoke Clause 7C, I said evenly, though my voice quivered with exhaustion. He flipped through the papers, eyebrows rising as he found the line I had marked. Are you certain, Mrs. Layla? He asked gently. Once this is enacted, their accounts will be frozen immediately. The business will be suspended. I straightened in my chair, my side aching from Derek's kick, but my will firm. They left me no choice. Do it. By the time Lydia and Derek woke up that morning, the storm had already broken. The bank had locked their accounts. The restaurant suppliers were notified that all contracts were suspended. Workers arrived to find the doors chained shut, a notice taped to the window, closed pending financial review. I imagine the phone calls started soon after. Derek shouting into the receiver, his voice cracking as supplier after supplier refused to deliver, the florist pulling out, the bakery refusing to provide the cake, the liquor distributor canceling shipments, their perfect plans unraveling thread by thread. By noon, Derek's rage boiled over. He stormed into the driveway of the house, his face red, his shirt half-buttoned, veins bulging at his neck. You old witch, he roared, his voice carrying down the block. You destroyed my business. You've ruined me. His fist slammed against the hood of his car, leaving a dent that matched the fury in his eyes. You'll pay for this. Do you hear me? You'll pay. But I had already been paying, for decades. Paying with my body, my labor, my savings, my dignity. His debt was long overdue. Inside the house, Lydia's shrill voice carried, Mother, what have you done? You've ruined everything. This was our future. You've destroyed my life. I watched from a distance, hidden just beyond the corner of the street. I saw her face pale with panic, saw the way her hands shook as she clutched her phone, begging vendors to reconsider, only to be turned away one by one. I saw Derek pacing, spitting curses, his empire crumbling around him, and I felt calm. For years, I had been their silent servant, their scapegoat, their easy target. But now, in less than 24 hours, the power had shifted. Their cruelty had unlocked the very trap they had set for me. They had built their dreams on my back, never once imagining I had the strength to shrug them off. By evening, their so-called empire was ashes. The restaurant that was supposed to be Derek's crown jewel stood dark and silent. The wedding Lydia had bragged about, boasting of fine wine, endless food, and a celebration grand enough to impress Texas society, was in ruins. The deposits were gone, the vendors withdrawn, and every guest they had tried to impress would soon hear whispers of disaster. I returned to my small rented room that night, the pillow pressed against my ribs, my body sore but my heart steady. They thought they had cast me out with nothing, but in truth, I had taken the one thing that mattered: control. Their laughter had turned to shouting, their triumph had turned to panic. And as I closed my eyes, I knew this was only the beginning. They had wanted me to obey or get out. I had gotten out, yes, but I had taken their future with me. A week after the restaurant doors slammed shut and Derek's empire crumbled overnight, Lydia still clung to one thing she believed was unshakable: the house. That house, with its polished wood floors and sprawling kitchen, the same house where she had told me to obey or get out, was her last fortress. I knew it from the way she carried herself, pacing through the rooms with false confidence, muttering to Derek, "At least we still have this. She can't touch this. This is ours." But she was wrong. The house had never been theirs. The down payment had come from me, my retirement money folded neatly into the palms of the realtor. The mortgage had been secured under my name because Derek's credit was too poor and Lydia's income too unstable to qualify. I had signed every line, sat through every closing, and held the deed in my hands. They had convinced themselves it belonged to them because I had stayed quiet, because I had allowed them to decorate, to claim, to stomp through its halls as if they were rulers of a castle. But I had always been the true owner. And now, it was time to remind them. I walked into the county clerk's office that Monday morning with the same leather folder tucked under my arm. My ribs still ached when I took a deep breath, but I held myself tall. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked over the papers, double-checked the signatures, and gave me a quiet smile. "Mrs. Layla," she said softly, "are you sure about this?" I nodded. "Yes, I want it transferred." The new deed was written not in my daughter's name, not in Derek's, but in the name of the Oak Haven Retirement Home, a modest but well-kept residence for seniors just outside of town. The director had been astonished when I proposed it. "You would donate the entire house?" she asked. "Are you certain?" "I am," I said, "but there are conditions. My room must be permanent. No one can take it away from me. And when I am gone, it should go to someone else who has been cast out, someone whose children have forgotten them. This house will not be a cage of cruelty. It will be a refuge." She pressed my hands in hers, tears in her eyes, and promised it would be so. When Lydia and Derek found out, the storm that followed was worse than any I had seen. They came tearing into the house, slamming doors, throwing cushions across the room, shouting so loudly the neighbors gathered outside to listen. "You can't do this," Lydia screamed, her face blotchy with rage. "This is my house. My children live here. You're stealing from me." I stood calmly in the living room, papers folded neatly in my lap. "No," I said, quietly, "I am reclaiming what was always mine. You made this house unlivable for me. Now it will be a place of peace for others." Derek's eyes bulged as he threw a lamp against the wall, the crash echoing down the hallway. "You old witch!" he shouted. "You've taken everything from me, my business, my future, and now my home. Where the hell are we supposed to go?" I met his fury with silence, letting it wash over me like a tide that could not move a stone. Lydia dropped to her knees, tears streaking her face. "Mother, please," she begged, the same mouth that had once told me to get out, now twisting into desperation. "Think of the children. You can't throw us into the street. You're heartless." The words stung, not because I believed them, but because I remembered the countless times I had sacrificed to keep her safe, warm, fed. Heartless? I had given her my life, and in return she had demanded I wash her husband's feet and sleep outside like a beggar. I rose from my chair and handed her the papers. "It's done, signed, sealed, recorded. This house no longer belongs to me or to you. It belongs to Oak Haven. They will decide its future, not you." She snatched the papers from my hands, scanning them with trembling eyes, her face blanching as she read the official stamps and signatures. Her sobs grew louder, her body shaking. Derek cursed under his breath, kicking at the baseboards as though breaking wood could undo ink. But nothing they did mattered. The house was gone. That night, I walked the halls one last time. My hand brushed along the walls I had painted, the banister I had polished, the window where I had once stood waiting for Lydia to come home from school. The house was heavy with memories, but none of them lived in the present anymore. The present was filled only with contempt, scorn, and violence. In my room, I folded my pillow under my arm. It was the only thing they had left me, and it was all I needed, The bed, the closet, the chair, they could keep them. What mattered was that my dignity remained intact and that the walls of this house would no longer hear my cries of humiliation. They would hear laughter again, but not Derek's, not Lydia's, not their children's. They would hear the laughter of elders finding safety, of the forgotten being remembered. When I closed the door behind me and stepped into the night, I felt no sorrow, only release. The next morning, Derek and Lydia woke to find strangers from the retirement home walking through the property, taking notes, assessing repairs. Their shouts carried down the block. "Get out!" Derek bellowed. "This is our house!" But the officials ignored him. The paperwork was done, and the law was clear. He was nothing here anymore. By evening, Lydia sat on the front steps, her face streaked with mascara, clutching her children as though they might disappear. Derek paced beside her, muttering curses, powerless for the first time in his arrogant life, and I, watching from across the street, felt something I had not felt in years. Justice. They thought the house was their stronghold, the one thing I could never take. But they had forgotten whose name was written on the deed. They had forgotten that silence does not mean surrender. And in the end, the house they had used to cage me became the key to their downfall. Derek always believed he held all the power, that his name on the marquee of his shuttered restaurant made him untouchable, that his loud voice and clenched fists could bend the world to his will. What he never realized, what neither he nor Lydia had ever cared to ask, was that I still held a quiet piece of his empire in my hands. When he had begged for investors to fund his business, I had signed the paperwork not only as guarantor, but as shareholder. A small percentage, tucked neatly away in my name, insignificant enough that he never paid it any mind. To him, I was a silent partner, too old and too meek to ever cash in. But silence is not the same as weakness. While Derek raged at the locked doors of his restaurant and Lydia wept over the loss of their house, I sat at a lawyer's desk with pen in hand, transferring my shares into something far greater than either of them could imagine. The Layla Women's Shelter, an organization I had long admired for its work protecting women cast aside by husbands and children alike, was in desperate need of funds. Their waiting list grew every month, their beds always full, their kitchen always stretched to feed one more hungry mouth. I thought of the women I had met there once before, women who carried bruises under long sleeves, women whose children clung to them in fear, women who reminded me too much of myself. And I thought, why should Derek's arrogance not be used to lift them? Why should his cruelty not build their safety? So I signed. Every share I held, every ounce of his business that still bore value, I transferred to the Layla Women's Shelter. The lawyer looked up at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "This will make headlines, you know," he said. "Are you prepared for that?" I met his gaze without hesitation. Let it. 2 days later, the news broke. The Texas Tribune ran the headline first. "Disgraced restaurateur's shares transferred to Women's Shelter." Beneath it, in bold letters, a subheading read, "Daughter's betrayal turns into mother's legacy." The article detailed the clause, the contract, the transfer. It spelled out how Derek, the man who had publicly mocked and assaulted his mother-in-law, had indirectly become the unwilling benefactor of a shelter supporting women just like her. The story spread like wildfire. Local TV stations picked it up, anchors shaking their heads as they described Derek's downfall. One station even showed a split screen. On the left, footage of Derek storming out of his shuttered restaurant, shouting at reporters. On the right, the smiling faces of women and children at the shelter as they accepted the funds. The contrast was brutal, and it was glorious. Neighbors whispered. Customers who once dined at his tables laughed behind his back. On Facebook, someone wrote, "Imagine treating your own mother-in-law like dirt only for your money to end up helping abused women." Karma doesn't miss. Thousands liked the comment, and it spread far beyond our little town. Derek had wanted to be famous in Texas dining. Instead, he became infamous as the fool whose arrogance bankrolled the very cause that condemned him. Derek went mad with rage. He stormed into Lydia's kitchen, throwing chairs, his face purple with fury. "That old hag has ruined me," he shouted. "She's turned me into a joke. Do you understand? Every man in town is laughing at me, saying I'm funding battered women's shelters. This is humiliation." But his words were his own undoing. Lydia flinched at his tone, at the way spit flew from his mouth, at the resemblance between his rants and the very men the shelter was built to protect women from. For the first time, perhaps, she saw him not as the husband she defended, but as the bully he had always been. Lydia, too, could not escape the shame. Her friends called her behind her back the daughter who sold her mother out, the woman whose wedding turned into scandal, the girl who lost her house to her own mom. She walked into stores and felt the eyes of strangers on her, heard the murmurs, "That's her, the one whose mom outsmarted them all." The humiliation clung to her like smoke, inescapable. Meanwhile, the women's shelter held a press conference. The director, standing tall in front of the modest brick building, thanked the anonymous benefactor by name. "This gift comes from Layla," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A woman who understands what it means to be forgotten, to be dismissed, and to rise anyway. Because of her, dozens of women and children will sleep safe tonight." The cameras captured every word. Reporters wrote stories not about Derek's supposed greatness, but about the quiet strength of a grandmother who turned her pain into protection for others. The shelter even renamed one of its wings, the Layla Wing of Hope. And so, while Derek stomped and cursed, and Lydia sobbed into her hands, I walked through the halls of that shelter. Children's laughter echoed there, the sound of healing in progress. Women with tired eyes but hopeful smiles shook my hand, whispering thank yous that warmed me more than any title, any mansion, any inheritance could. Derek had not just lost money. He had been forced, unwillingly, into the role of benefactor for the very women he despised. His cruelty had written his legacy, but my pen had rewritten it into justice, and the entire state of Texas laughed, not at me, not at my pillow, not at my silence, but at him. I never lived for riches, and I never sought power. What I wanted most was dignity, and in giving it to others, I found mine restored. So, when the accounts closed, when Derek's restaurant sat in darkness and Lydia wept at the loss of her so-called inheritance, I did not keep everything for myself. That had never been my way. I thought of the women in the shelter, their weary eyes lighting with hope as the funds poured in. And then I thought of the elderly faces I had seen at Oak Haven, the retirement home I had entrusted with my house. There were men and women there who had stories like mine, children who had abandoned them, families who had treated them as burdens, voices that had gone unheard for decades. Some sat in cramped rooms, their belongings stacked in corners, the walls peeling from years of neglect. They deserved better. So I met with the director again, folder in hand, my pillow tucked under my arm. She looked at me with gentle surprise as I laid down the papers. "There's more," I told her. "I want to use part of the returned funds to renovate, to make this place shine, a place where no one feels discarded, a place where people know they matter." Her eyes filled with tears. "Miss Layla," she whispered, "you've already given us so much. You don't need to—" "I do," I interrupted softly, "because I know what it feels like to be told you are nothing, and I refuse to let another elder live in that kind of shadow." The work began within weeks. Walls were repainted, floors polished, new furniture brought in. A small garden was planted just outside the common room, where flowers bloomed bright against the Texas sun. And most importantly, a new wing was opened, modest but warm, with sunlight streaming through large windows and the scent of fresh cedar on the air. At the entrance, a bronze plaque was mounted on the wall. The letters gleamed proudly, "The Layla Room, Benefactor and Protector." The day of its unveiling, the residents gathered in their best clothes, their faces bright with anticipation. Some leaned on canes, some sat in wheelchairs, but every eye shone with gratitude. When the curtain fell and the plaque was revealed, applause filled the hall, not the mocking laughter I had endured at my daughter's table, but genuine clapping, joyful, thunderous. An elderly man with trembling hands reached for mine. "You've done more for us than our own families ever did," he said, his voice breaking. "You're a hero, Mrs. Layla." Another woman, her hair silver like mine, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "You've given us back our pride. You've given us a home that feels like love." They called me our champion, our protector, our hero. Words I had longed, in secret, to hear from my own child but never did. words that mended parts of me I thought were broken forever. And as I stood there, surrounded by the clapping and the smiling faces of people who understood abandonment, who understood what it meant to be thrown aside by your own blood, I felt something deeper than revenge. I felt justice. It was not just about Derek and Lydia losing everything. It was about balance being restored. The cruel had fallen, stripped bare before the world, and the kind, the forgotten elders who had once wept in lonely rooms were lifted up. The house that had been poisoned with contempt now belonged to them. The money Derek thought would feed his pride now fed their hope. The shares he once waved like trophies now built rooms where laughter echoed and dignity lived again. For the first time in decades, I did not feel invisible. I was not the servant in someone else's home. I was the benefactor, the one whose silence had carried more power than all their shouting combined. As I walked through the renovated wing, residents pressed flowers into my hands, hugged me tightly, called my name with affection. My heart swelled, not with pride alone, but with peace, because justice had not only punished the ungrateful, it had lifted up the worthy. And I knew then that this was the legacy I wanted, not the memory of humiliation at a dinner table, but the truth of a grandmother who turned cruelty into kindness, betrayal into refuge. The cruel had lost everything they valued, but the forgotten had gained everything they needed, and in that, true justice was complete. Neighbors who once pitied me now shook their heads at Lydia and Derek. At the grocery store, I overheard two women by the produce aisle, whispering. One said they thought they could make her obey, like some servant. The other chuckled bitterly. And now the whole state obeys her story. Imagine that, wanting your mother to bow, and now your mother's name is in every paper in Texas. Their laughter was not cruel this time. It was the sound of justice finding its audience. For Derek, the humiliation was unbearable. His phone stopped ringing. Investors who once begged for his time now ghosted him. Old friends avoided him in public, crossing the street to escape his gaze. Men who had toasted his ambition now raised glasses to mock his fall. He cursed loudly in parking lots, red-faced, lashing out at anyone who dared meet his eye. His pride had rotted into bitterness, and everyone could smell it. Lydia, too, was drowning in shame. Friends distanced themselves. Parents at her children's school whispered about her in the hallways. "That's the one," they murmured. "The daughter who betrayed her own mother, the one who thought she could strip her down and came out empty-handed." Her shoulders hunched lower each day, her voice quieter, her once sharp tongue dulled by the sting of disgrace. Weeks passed before she came to me. It was late afternoon when I saw her car pull into the driveway of Oak Haven, where I now spent much of my time visiting the new residents who called the Layla Wing their home. She sat in the car for a long time before stepping out, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. When she finally walked up the steps, her footsteps were hesitant, dragging as though weighted with the burden of all she had lost. When she saw me in the common room, she froze, her lip trembling. For a long moment she said nothing, her eyes darting to the plaque with my name on it, to the residents smiling as they played cards in the sunshine. Finally she broke. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she fell to her knees in front of me. "Mom." Her voice cracked like glass. "Mom, I was wrong. I was blind. Please, I need you. Derek is gone most nights, drinking, raging. The kids, they ask me why we lost the house, why everyone looks at us funny. I don't know what to say anymore." Her sobs filled the room, raw and desperate. "I treated you like nothing, but you're everything. Please, help me." I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, my heart both aching and firm. Once, I would have gathered her into my arms, soothed her tears, promised her it would be all right. But that mother, the one who gave without condition, who bent until she nearly broke, was gone. In her place sat a woman who had learned the hard way that respect must be demanded, not begged for. Quietly, I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I laid it on the table between us. Lydia's swollen eyes blinked as she leaned forward to read. "Conditions for reconciliation, a public apology to me, your mother, for the humiliation, the insults, and the betrayal. Not whispered in secret, but spoken aloud where others can hear, just as your cruelty once was. A public apology to the staff and residents of Oak Haven Retirement Home. You mocked me, but they took me in with kindness. you will honor them. A public apology to the Layla Women's Shelter. Your husband's name, and by extension yours, will forever be tied to their cause. You will not run from it. You will stand beside it and acknowledge their worth. You will commit to family therapy. Not for my sake, but for your children's. You must learn that motherhood is not servitude and that respect is not optional. Lydia's hands shook as she clutched the paper. Her tears fell onto the ink, smudging the letters. "Mom, this is humiliating," she whispered. The story spread across Texas like wildfire. Newspapers carried the headline in bold letters. "Ungrateful daughter and greedy son-in-law lose everything after publicly humiliating elderly mother." The articles described every detail: the restaurant shuttered, the house transferred, the shares redirected to the women's shelter, the new wing at the retirement home gleaming with fresh paint and flowers. My name, once whispered only in the shadow of their contempt, now appeared in print as a symbol of quiet justice. Her sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking. "I'll do it," she choked out. "I'll do whatever it takes." I watched her, my chest tight with the ache of love and disappointment. I had not closed the door on her entirely. I had left her a path back, but it was narrow, steep, and paved with contrition. Whether she walked it was her choice. The residents in the Layla wing looked on quietly, their eyes soft, their nods small but approving. They understood. They too had been cast aside, and they knew that dignity, once restored, cannot be bartered away easily. That day, I did not embrace my daughter. I did not rise to comfort her. Instead, I let her cry, let her sit in the truth she had built for herself. I had given her the terms. The rest was up to her. And as she sat trembling in her shame, I felt no guilt, only peace. Because the world now knew the truth. The reporters, the neighbors, the strangers in grocery stores, they had seen her betrayal, and they had seen my strength. Lydia had wanted me to obey her husband or get out. I had gotten out, yes, but I had taken everything she counted on with me. That was the price. And finally, at last, she was paying it. And so, my dear ones, that is the end of my story. A story born not from shouting or revenge, but from silence, that carried more weight than any scream could. They thought they had stripped me of everything, my home, my dignity, even my place at the table. But what they never understood was that silence is not surrender. Silence is a seed, and when the time is right, it grows into justice. When my daughter told me to obey her husband or get out, I left with nothing but my pillow. Yet in leaving, I took everything they had built on my back. Their pride, their wealth, their false sense of power, it crumbled in the quiet, just as surely as the sun sets at the end of a long day. I sit now in the room that bears my name, my hands resting on the pillow they mocked, watching the Texas sky burn gold and crimson. I do not shout. I do not gloat. I only smile, because I know this truth. Justice does not always roar. It often comes in silence, and always right on time. If you have stayed with me until this moment, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. These stories are not easy to tell, but they are true, and they remind us that strength has no age and revenge has no expiration date. If my story touched you, if it stirred something in your heart, I invite you to stay with me for more. This porch, these memories, this voice, they will keep speaking. So please, subscribe to Grandma, True Stories, and walk with me through the chapters of a life that refused to stay silent, because sometimes, when a grandmother tells her truth, the whole world listens.